This is Asia Insight, Asia Policy in a Pod.
Asia Policy, NBR's quarterly peer-reviewed journal, marks its 20th anniversary this year, celebrating 2 decades of bridging the academic and policy worlds. On April 17, 2026, Asia Policy published an essay by Dr. Evan Medeiros, A New Era of U.S.-China Interaction from Competing to Racing, which argues that the 2025 U.S.-China trade war marked a potential inflection point in the bilateral competition, now increasingly driven by supply chains, choke points, and technological leverage. In this episode of Asia Insight, Evan Medeiros, Director of Asian Studies and the Pinar Family Chair at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and Gerard DePippo, Director for Global Macro at the Eurasia Group, joined NBR Senior Director of Research and Programs, Doug Strube, to unpack what shifted in 2025, what it revealed about the evolving rivalry between Washington and Beijing, and what comes next.
Evan, Gerard, it's great to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining. Well, I'd like to start with a question about Evan's new paper in Asia Policy, looking at the evolution of U.S.-China relations and tensions during the second Trump administration so far. A lot has happened in the last year in U.S.-China relations, and you've outlined how this relationship and the strategic competition has evolved from a broader tariff strategy and trade war to a narrower technology controls, supply chain choke points, and gaining leverage in areas like critical minerals and semiconductors has really become the focal point. Could you talk about that evolution, what's driving it, and how that's shifted?
Thanks, Doug. I'm very excited about the release of my new article in Asia Policy that looks at what I call a new era of U.S.-China interactions from competing to racing. And basically what I argue is that the trade war of 2025 between the U.S. and China was a major strategic turning point in this early phase of U.S.-China strategic competition. You know, in the Cold War, it had its turning points like the Berlin airlift. Now, look, the trade war wasn't as, war and peace like, it wasn't as harrowing as the Berlin airlift, but I think the strategic effects are just as significant because it revealed new power dynamics at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. Most basically, it put trade competition, or I should say economic competition, technology competition at the top of the list. Those are clearly the priority areas of competition in the U.S.-China relationship. The Cold War had ideological competition and military competition. Economics and technology are at the top for the United States and China. Number two, the events of 2025 revealed that it was less a trade war and more a supply chain war. And by a supply chain war, what I mean is both sides focusing on and leveraging choke point technologies to generate leverage and to elicit behavior. And a natural consequence of that was it became very clear that tariffs were just not a terribly effective tool in the U.S. arsenal for economic competition for China. I often point out that in retrospect, and I think this is a point that Gerard highlighted to me when I was working on my article, that in 2025, China picked up global market share in exports, right? So clearly tariffs didn't have a negative effect on China in any significant sort of aggregate way. So tariffs weren't terribly effective. So as a result, both sides pivoted to focusing on choke point technologies, which made this a supply chain war. Those choke point technologies, or I should say choke point items, were rare earths on the Chinese side and a variety of sort of specific items on the U.S. side. Software for developing semiconductors, jet engines for Chinese commercial aircraft, and then, of course, U.S. controls on advanced chip sales to China. All of those emerged as a sort of source of competition. And it actually turned out to have been quite effective because both sides were able to hold at risk meaningful technologies and goods for the other side that unleashed this round of negotiations from Geneva to London to Stockholm to Madrid, et cetera, et cetera. And what was clear was the Chinese had identified, operationalized, effectively weaponized rare earths as a source of leverage that the U.S. simply didn't have any response to. And so the dynamic that I argue that's emerging between the United States and China is very much a race. The Chinese are sprinting to be able to produce advanced semiconductors. Our advantage in building advanced semiconductors and controlling the supply chain for building advanced semiconductors is a significant source of leverage for us. And of course, China's rare earths are a significant source of leverage for them. And we, of course, have initiated programs to reduce our massive dependence on China. But of course, it's going to take quite a bit of time. And so that's why I titled the article From Competing to Racing, because this focus on identifying sources of leverage, identifying vulnerabilities, trying to accentuate leverage, minimize vulnerabilities on the economic side is going to be the core dynamic as both sides race to expand leverage and reduce vulnerabilities. Some people have sort of speculated that we've reached a plateau of stability because both sides can hold each other at risk, a sort of economic version of mutual assured destruction. But what I point out in the article is that the stability of today may be based on other things than mutual vulnerability. But the other thing I like to remind people of is it actually took the US and the Soviets a very long time to actually achieve a stabilizing world of mutual assured destruction. And of course, it was structural. I don't think the stability in the US-China economic relationship is structural. And final point here, and this is where I want to thank my colleagues at Georgetown who do nuclear strategy, and in particular my colleague Keir Lieber, is that he reminded me that under the conditions of MAD during the Cold War, both the US and Soviets were actively working on a daily basis to extract themselves, find ways to exit MAD because they didn't like that vulnerability, which created a new source of instability in the relationship. So I really don't think that the MAD analogy from the Cold War is appropriate or useful in the US-China economic context. Over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Evan. I want to come back to a couple points you made looking forward in a bit. But Gerard, I'd like to come over to you and look deeper at this point that Evan made about tariffs not being as effective of a tool as the US side may have thought. It seemed early in the Trump administration, maybe policymakers were assuming that some of the challenges going on in China economically with slowing growth, low domestic consumption, high debt, unemployment, etc., provided a source of leverage where tariffs might lead to enough economic pain to change China's behavior. But as Evan highlights in his essay, that hasn't really panned out, and the US has sort of changed its toolkit. And then just recently, we've seen China's Q1 2026 economic data that looked, I think, better than a lot of people expected. These early US calculations about China's economic slowdown wrong, or how has that played out? And then how is China's continued economic growth impacting US strategic thinking towards the relationship?
We'll talk about the economic side first, and then we'll talk about the strategic side. On the economic side, China's economy has been quite weak by China standards since roughly 2022. That is largely a function of their deflating or collapsing property sector. But they have since then been relying more on exports than they had been, say, for the previous 10 years before that. They're still mostly a domestically oriented economy. I think one triggering factor in terms of beliefs about retaliatory capabilities in the White House is that President Trump has a well-established love of tariffs and a belief that tariffs are economically determinative. But the reality is, for very large economies like the United States and China, trade is important, especially for China. But they're still actually mostly self-sufficient overall in terms of total activity. And the vulnerabilities are not as salient as he believes. Now, the early on, if at beginning of 2025, if you had asked economists if the U.S. were to eventually impose 145% tariffs on China, what would happen to Chinese trade and to Chinese economy, that you probably would have gotten not catastrophic, but fairly dire forecasts of what would happen. Evan's piece goes into great detail about the sequencing here, which I'll skip for now. But suffice to say that China did face an enormous trade shock vis-a-vis the United States last year, but their export performance was quite resilient. They were able to do that basically by diverting, rerouting trade that would have gone to the United States to elsewhere. And for the year, the trade continued to grow. So by my estimates, after starting in April of last year through December, so to the duration essentially of the trade war of last year, about 2/3 of the exports that China lost, meaning it was no longer shipping to the United States at the product level, found markets elsewhere. And of that, only about 20% is potentially being rerouted or, quote, transshipped to to the United States through third countries, which is to say that the vast majority of China's trade diversion was actually new markets and a type of resilience. Now, the caveat is that China was already facing deflation, meaning falling prices, including in its exports. That also meant that profit margins for exporters in China were falling. So they were able to offset the shock by increasing volumes, but cutting margins. So it economically did hurt. But if you look at total trade flows, it looks fairly benign. That said, I think the broader point is that trade is sort of the very important release valve or stabilizing factor for the Chinese economy, but it is not the primary driver. That's the domestic economy. I mentioned Q1 of this year. The bottom line there is that, yes, China's economy is apparently re-accelerating, and some of that is through reinflation, but it's not exactly a good news story because domestic demand, including for consumption, remains weaker. In fact, it's weaker than GDP growth. There's still a lot of export reliance, and the near exit from deflation is apparently mostly due to the price shock from the Iran war, because you see it very clearly in energy prices and raw materials, but you continue to see deflation in things like services and consumer goods. So the Chinese economy is definitely not out of the woods yet, but it is certainly more resilient than Donald Trump would have expected. Your second question, which is a big one, I would just say it is probably worth fleshing out to the extent we even can. What was it that the Trump administration was trying to do here? And I would postulate that while there are definite continuities between the Biden and Trump administration, as Evan lays out in his piece, in the Biden administration, trade, which is to say tariff policy, and export control policy were largely divergent tracks, and the Biden administration did not want to negotiate with China, really over either, but certainly didn't want to negotiate over export controls. The Trump administration, Trump sees tariffs as primarily a point of leverage to get what he wants, but also maybe to cause reshoring in the United States, which hasn't really worked very well, and also to get revenue. Now, these are all contradictory objectives, but he wants to achieve all three. The trade war, so to speak, started with a series of small trade actions early in 2025, but the big one was on quote Liberation Day, the beginning of April of 2025, where the White House expected minimal or no response from China. China, of course, did retaliate, which China Watch could have said they were going to do. And then we got into this escalatory spiral. And I said it because once we got to the massive 145% tariffs, the objective was just to get China to go back basically to status quo before the trade war had started. It wasn't actually the point. It wasn't really just to hurt China. They thought that the weakness of the Chinese economy might make China more willing to just suck it up and take it. But that wasn't the point. The point was actually the tariffs per se. And then the export controls entered the discussion through a series of escalations, which Evan talks about in his piece.
Thanks. Evan, over to you on the strategic side there. As Gerard noted, you go through this in quite a bit of depth in your paper and detail. How do you see that economic element playing out throughout the Trump administration, from that escalatory tariffs to this pivot to the narrower technology controls and competition over strategic leverage on supply chains?
As of today, we're in a very different place than we were a year ago. I went through in great detail the sequence of the trade war simply because the detail is quite important to understand the power dynamics at play. Who used what sources of leverage when? How did that dynamic work out? And in the beginning of the podcast, I sort of explained my top line conclusions. As of today, we're in a very different place because, as I outlined in the piece, as of October 31st, when Trump and Xi met in Busan, South Korea, on the margins of APEC, they basically reached a ceasefire in the trade war that had many different elements to it. And both sides have pretty religiously complied with the various dimensions of the ceasefire in Busan that has allowed the Trump administration to pivot to what I call a commercial détente strategy, trying to turn that ceasefire in the trade war into something that looks like a more enduring basis for an economic relationship. And so when we enter 2026, the important thing to understand is that the Trump administration's view is that in 2026, there could be up to 4 meetings between Trump and Xi this year. Trump visiting Beijing, Xi Jinping reciprocating, and then the U.S. hosting the G20, China hosting APEC. And the hope is that through those 4 meetings this year, they can achieve a series of economic agreements that address all the grievances and concerns that Gerard talked about. And at a minimum, That's agreements to continue the ceasefire, which in China's mind means a continued freeze on further American competitive actions toward China, such as a freeze on further controls on high-tech exports and perhaps limited episodic liberalization, like the sale of the H200 NVIDIA chip and its AMD counterpart. Of course, the Americans want affirmation of the Chinese commitment to continue to sell rare earths under the agreement reached in Busan. Secretary of Treasury Besant said it just this week that remains an important priority. And then it's about getting access to Chinese markets for agricultural goods. So Trump just simply wants the Chinese to resume their purchase of agricultural goods, probably to the level before the trade war started. There's a big Boeing plane buy on the table, 500 planes, largest single purchase of Boeing planes by a single country in the history of Boeing. So there's a bunch of commercial deliverables. The tricky part of all this is these trade issues and the economic issues are probably going to be linked to geopolitical issues. So it's very well known that the Chinese are pushing the Trump administration for some changes in Taiwan policy. Number one, they don't want the Trump administration to approve a second arms sales package to Taiwan, which apparently is in the pipeline. Number two, they want Trump to commit to a shift in declaratory policy. So that's sort of where the commercial détente is. And I think a lot of that is driven by the fact that both sides, through this supply chain war of 2025, realized that they both had leverage. Neither one of them had particular answers to that leverage that were, at a minimum, disruptive. In the case of the United States, the rare earth control were more than disruptive for both civilian and defense sectors in the United States. And so I think for both sides really want stability at this point in the relationship. The Chinese want stability, and they hope they can leverage some change in Taiwan policy, and the Trump administration needs time. I've heard some of their public estimates that within 18 months to 2 years, they will substantially reduce U.S. vulnerability to rare earths. I don't think there are any experts out there that agree with that. So we're really talking about a 5-year window. So the Chinese are coming into the relationship with an exceptional degree of confidence. In my interactions with Chinese scholars and former policymakers, I've been struck by the degree of confidence that they have, that they understand Trump, they know what he wants, they have a game plan, and they have leverage in reserve that the administration really doesn't have any response to. And that's why this race dynamic to me is such an important way to frame this moment in the relationship, but it also highlights that the stability of today is not a structural stability. I think it's based on very short-term factors related to domestic political concerns in both countries. And so it may very well be ephemeral, short-lived.
Following up on that, this reminds me of a conversation I had nearly a decade ago with Professor David Shambaugh. He talked about China's strategy basically being to freeze the U.S. with the illusion of engagement just by engaging in this endless series of dialogues and discussions without really making any meaningful change or arriving at any substantial conclusions. When you're talking about the Trump administration now needing time to develop U.S. capacities in terms of developing alternate critical mineral supply chains and needing that sort of maybe 5-year window that you described. Do you see the U.S. using a similar strategy here that is contributing to this pause in tensions where the U.S. wants to avoid further escalatory actions because it needs time to develop its way out of some of these choke points?
So I do. I think for some people in the Trump administration, that's their approach. But if that's your approach, why did you start the trade war in the first place? So I think there's a little bit of ex post facto justification for their strategy. The worst kept secret in Washington is that Trump is not a hawk on China. He is neither a national security hawk or an economic hawk. And it's very well known that his view of diplomacy is dealing with strongman leaders. So he has an affinity for Xi Jinping. That's reflected in his public statements, right? There was just a tweet this week about getting a hug from Xi Jinping or something like that. So I think that it's not all this sort of grand strategic view that we're pausing competition to buy time to work on reducing our vulnerabilities, and then we're going to sort of jump back to competition. I think a little bit it's making a virtue out of a necessity, but I think the China hawks in the administration advance that idea of pausing competition to buy time because it sort of sounds good, but I think that's just simply a reality that they have to accept, motivated in part by Trump's own personal instincts and impulses towards Xi Jinping.
Gerard, coming back to a point Evan raised about the concept of mutually assured economic destruction, there's obviously a lot of potential consequences of further US-China deterioration in the relationship, but we haven't really touched on the broader global impact as well, as that impacts economies all over the world. Could you talk a bit more about how these developments are impacting the global economy and whether you think that's impacting the US or China's strategic thinking or approach toward this situation?
I would separate it in directional terms. So the effects of US tariffs on China versus the effect of China's retaliation, primarily through controls on rare earths. The problem with the first of the US tariffs is the US is also waging trade wars with the entire world in the middle of this. And so the main shock there for other countries was the fact that the Trump administration was imposing tariffs at varying levels and trying to have negotiations with pretty much all major economies at the same time. Insofar as the question is, what was the effect of US tariffs just on China? It's really what I was saying before, that it caused trade diversion from China flowing away from the US towards elsewhere, which is an issue for maybe Europe and some other regions where it meant that there is further deflationary pressures on those exports, which has some protectionist concerns in those countries because it basically gives Chinese competitors more of an edge. The Chinese response, I think, if you just take the bilateral action on its own, was more cataclysmic because the main action, which Evan lays out in his piece, there were previous rare earth and germanium actions, but the really big one was in October when the Chinese government announced a set of sweeping export controls that included the Chinese version of what the U.S. calls the foreign direct product rule, meaning that essentially China was declaring the right to demand permission of countries to send goods between each other that contained Chinese content in the form of rare earths, which would have effectively, if you read it literally, given China a veto on, say, Germany sending an EV to Poland because it had a battery that had Chinese components in it. And that freaked out businesses everywhere. And that is what is triggering much more of a global response insofar as the specific actions are concerned. So now you are seeing resiliency efforts in rare earths there is a somewhat allied coordinated effort, but there's also efforts independently in the EU, in the US, in Japan, Korea, elsewhere, to not wanting to rely so much on China for rare earths because China has weaponized that choke point. And so maybe the way to think about it is that the US was using a very broad and blunt tool against China, which it also was using against pretty much everyone else, whereas China was using a narrow but very deep tool that had disproportionate effect on certain key industries, including the automotive sector and defense. And in order to enforce that, in order to have that leverage against the United States, it would have been difficult for China to say everyone could have whatever they want, but the controls only apply to the United States. Instead, they said the controls apply to everyone, and everyone has to apply to MOFCOM for a license. And that meant that MOFCOM ran into issues with their own administrative capacity to even clear things, even if they wanted to, which meant that Japanese, Korean, European firms were getting delayed or no shipments at all of rare earth magnets, and that was causing a lot of problems. That situation has gotten better, but that sort of Damocles, so to speak, is still hanging over our heads because the truce with regard to that set of export controls was only for a year. And of course, China reserves the right to use that again.
Gerard made a really important point. The whole episode in September, October of 2025 is very instructive because in response to the U.S. adoption of the affiliates rule, expanding the scope of application of the entities list, the Chinese response, as Gerard rightly pointed out, was this sort of massive global application of an foreign direct product rule like restriction on rare earths. And what was interesting was, number one, the fact that their response to the affiliates rule was so substantial, that it was so dramatically extraterritorial. And also the fact that there was not just U.S. pushback, there was global pushback against it. So I think the Chinese learned something in doing that, that yes, they had sort of escalation dominance, but the application of that particular measure ended up being a lot costlier than they expected. And as Gerard hinted at, I think the Chinese also realized there's no way we can implement this. We probably don't have the bureaucratic capacity to do so. In the rough and tumble world of US-China relations, as both sides are trying to understand the boundaries of competition and how to use vulnerabilities, I think that the Chinese learned a very, very important lesson in the super broad application of the global application of the rare earth controls, that it wasn't a credible weapon to deploy.
Evan, you've talked about this as a race to secure leverage and position themselves to emerge ahead in this competition. Given the current situation and the two countries' strategic, economic, and development trajectories, which country do you think is best positioned to win this race?
I think that U.S. vulnerability to China is quite broad, and it may be broader than we know because the Chinese have only operationalized their monopoly on the rare earth supply chains, but it's entirely possible there are other supply chains specifically related to pharmaceuticals where the U.S. might have an equally significant vulnerability that the Chinese could leverage. Number two, it's been demonstrated through the trade war, as Gerard pointed out, that tariffs are not a particularly great source of leverage. So I see the U.S. vulnerability at this particular moment as quite broad. Our leverage is relatively narrow. I think it's the opposite in the Chinese case. I think that their leverage against us is actually quite broad and their vulnerability to us is relatively narrow. But of course, there's one exception to this, which is the U.S. dominance of the global financial sector, which we should talk about because the prospect of cutting China off from global dollar business, SWIFT transactions, or to use Gerard's favorite example, putting Chinese financial officials on the SDN list or something like that, if I got that right, Gerard.
My example would be if the U.S. went after the major banks and the central bank itself, like a stronger version of what we did with Russia.
Absolutely. My argument would be while the U.S. clearly dominates the global financial sector, it's not a credible source of leverage. In other words, it's so disruptive globally, it hurts the United States so much. So I don't think it's sort of terribly credible. So when I look at the balance of leverage, as I said, I think U.S. leverage is narrow, its vulnerabilities are broad. With China, it's the reverse. China has broad leverage, and it may be broader than we really know. Its vulnerabilities are relatively narrow, and the Chinese are actively working on both reducing those vulnerabilities and building buffers around them. But that's just the snapshot of today, Doug, right? I think the best answer to your question is it really depends on the domestic policymaking on both sides. And that's why the racing dynamic is so important. Is number one, the leaders on both sides agree with this dynamic? And number two, are they adopting the domestic policies to address vulnerabilities and to expand leverage? So I'm not prepared to make a prediction about the future because it really depends on domestic priorities and what both sides are prepared to do and how well they do as this race dynamic to reduce vulnerabilities and expands leverage, I think becomes the defining part of the power calculation between the United States and China in this incipient early phase of strategic competition.
I would take a slightly different view, which is that I think that the mutual leverage over each other is going to be stabilizing for the short to medium term. And as Evan already said, there's no prospect of the U.S. systematically reducing dependence on Chinese rare earths, at least for the duration of this Trump administration. So while there might be a political temptation to retaliate against China, in that case, I know what China's going to do. They're just going to shut down rare earth supplies again, and Trump will have to back off because Ford or GM or whatever will call him. And so I think of it as an arms race where both sides have demonstrated ability of not only having weapons, but the ability to use those weapons. That actually is maybe somewhat perversely stabilizing. I think the longer term is where it gets hazier because there are structural factors that I think will cause tension between the world's two largest economies. One thing that maybe I'll close on, which is something we haven't mentioned before, is artificial intelligence. I think the trajectory of that and the relative capabilities, whether China can keep being a fast follower or the U.S. gets a commanding lead, or maybe China wins in terms of global adoption, those factors are going to matter a lot, because if we agree that this is primarily an economic and technological competition, that the big part of technology that will then interact with the economy is artificial intelligence. I think that's the new front that neither side was really banking on 2 or 3 years ago, but now it's becoming increasingly clear.
Given where we're at now with the developments you both just talked about, and especially following China's more stringent critical minerals controls and how that shifted U.S. strategic thinking, where does that leave us? How are the countries adapting their approaches? And looking forward, what do you expect from both sides in terms of managing this relationship?
It's worth distinguishing the separate objectives of that leverage, right? So the U.S. and China both have economic coercive capabilities that they can aim against each other and others, of course. What China is mostly focused on, and the point of those rare earth controls, is essentially to deter the United States from taking further actions against them. And insofar as that ceasefire remains, China's, while it's building out its legal and administrative capacity to do so, it's not actually taking new measures. Whereas on the U.S. side, certainly at least going back to the Biden administration, some of those measures, especially export controls, were explicitly intended to degrade the Chinese economy, particularly in the technology sector, and slow China's semiconductor access and ability to develop artificial intelligence. China has done a few things like that in terms of battery controls and some other technologies, like with the technology to make permanent magnets for rare earths. But generally speaking, their measures are more defensive and less offensive. And I'm not saying in a normative sense, just mean descriptively what the intention is of those measures. Part of the reason for that is that China's strategy was and remains to basically buy time to keep the U.S. sort of in ceasefire mode so that it can pursue its own self-reliant strategies. There's been versions of this going back decades in China, but really it's been in overdrive since about 2018, where in the first trade war and after the U.S. took actions against ZTE and Huawei, the Chinese establishment realized, oh, the Americans actually not only will use tariffs, but they'll come after our best tech companies. And so it helped align the incentives with the central government and localities and companies in China, where they said, no, actually, we're all now exposed to the United States. And Chinese techno-industrial policy, which had been ramping up under Xi Jinping anyway, became very much prioritized in favor of self-reliance. And you can see that where the 14th five-year plan, which began in 2021, was a fairly notable break from the 13th because it was so focused on self-reliance. The 15th five-year plan, the one that was just announced, is actually more similar to the 14th. So the focus is basically buying time to pursue indigenization of technology in China, to break three of their choke points, including through, quote, extraordinary measures, which is language they use in a five-year plan to break through choke points for things like with semiconductors, lithography equipment, some materials, etc. But it's also to reduce China's reliances on the world in terms of commodities. So that would be for energy, food, and some other things, and also for finance, where they're building out a somewhat resilient but somewhat autonomous set of financial rails to insulate themselves from potential U.S. sanctions. So this is not new. This has been going for, I'd say, roughly 8 years in a pretty strong way. And so as long as the Chinese are confident they can keep the U.S. in some type of ceasefire mode, it buys them time to keep pursuing those objectives. And in the long run, I think the Chinese leadership is quite confident in their ability to eventually surmount, if not completely, at least enough, the U.S. chokehold over these various areas. And then at some point, China will have its own leverage in other domains that are not just that rare earths, and then maybe they can move to a more offensive posture should they want to.
Completely agree with Gerard. I thought it was very, very well said about what the Chinese incentives are. On the U.S. side, it's more complicated because theoretically, the U.S. should also want to buy time to reduce its vulnerabilities. But of course, there's multiple different political pressures on any administration to adopt more competitive strategies. And whereas, as Gerard rightly pointed out, China's approach is more defensive than offensive in nature. In other words, trying to buy time to better protect their economy. And that was reflected in some very important state council actions this past week, where they're trying to further reduce their vulnerability to global supply chains. In the United States, I would say it's sort of part defensive, part offensive. In other words, the offensive part being trying to adopt more actions to deny China access to our technology and our markets. And so, as we started out this podcast, we're in this interesting moment of both a ceasefire in the trade war and a broader strategic stability as we enter into this year of high-level summits and deal makings. My view is that it's not going to be sustainable, that there will be a snapback to a much more competitive phase in the relationship. And it may not occur until after these 4 interactions in 2026 are done. But I think that it's going to be hard for the Trump administration to politically sustain an abandonment of the competition agenda. I think it's entirely possible that after the midterms, the political calculations of the president change. I think it's entirely possible that the typical Chinese statecraft will generate a lot of frustration for Trump. If he feels like the Chinese are really diddling him, they're playing for time, playing for advantage, he could shift back to a more competitive posture as he did in the spring of 2020 in the lead up to the general election of 2020. So while I agree that there are incentives on both sides for stability, I don't think that these incentives are structural like they were between the U.S. and Soviets and MAD in the Cold War. And I think that there are huge political pressures that could change this dynamic. So sometime after the midterms, I think we might see a shift in U.S. policy.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on the show today and sharing your insights.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Asia Insight. Asia Insight podcasts can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information from the National Bureau of Asian Research, please visit our website at www.nbr.org.